2022, a group of computer scientists at Carnegie Mellon University were having a discussion online, and they were trying to figure out what the best way was to indicate whether a message they were posting in their computer bulletin board, an early version of online discussion boards, what was the best way to indicate whether a message was serious or a joke? Apparently there were some issues with understanding the meaning of some of the posts. Some suggested to use a star or a % sign in the title of the message to indicate when they were saying a joke. And one of them, by the name of Scott Fallman, suggested the use of 3 special characters. And at the time, he didn't know it, but these 3 special characters transform the way that we communicate online today. And I have a feeling you know which characters I'm talking about. This was his original message. The colon, the dash, and the right bracket, the smiley emoticon. And I bet you don't need his original instructions to read it sideways. So Scott had another proposal for messages that weren't jokes, although we use this one a little bit differently today. So from the early days of online interactions, users struggled with expressing the meaning of a message. What was so simple in face-to-face communication, what was so simple to express through body language, facial expressions, tone of voice, became really difficult online. So what we call nonverbal communication was really difficult to capture in these text-only contexts. So the smiley emoticon, in a sense, captured the nuance of the meaning of the message very simply, and it really caught on since then. And the emoticon evolved over the past 4 decades from the simple text-based images that we use to more recently emojis that were initially introduced in Japan. And then we've seen other forms of nonverbal communication online to express more complex social meaning. So in a sense, there's this evolution in form, and we've also seen a cultural evolution. So different cultures across the globe, they use emoticons differently. So early on, emoticons in the West, people focused more on the facial expression of the mouth, whereas in Eastern cultures, the eyes were more important. And also we see that in online communities, such as Facebook groups and Reddit, Twitch streams, people develop their own emoticons or emojis or different forms of expression, and they use unique symbols that are only known to the particular group. So in a sense, there's this rich repository that we've developed of this online language, nonverbal language, that adds meaning to the ambiguity of the text. And it can be understood across cultures, like the smiley emoticon, but also can be very culturally specific. So the question is, have emojis solved the problem of online communication, online nonverbal communication? Well, you probably agree that they have their place, and they've certainly become popular. But have you ever composed a message where what you meant to convey wasn't really understood that way on the other end? Like in this example. I'm sure many of you have been on either end of this type of discussion. So in fact, misunderstandings like this are quite common. Researchers at the University of Minnesota found that people disagree 25% of the time about the meaning of different emoticons, about the emotional valence of these emoticons, whether they're positive, negative, or neutral. And this disagreement can actually increase when you're sending them across different platforms, like from Apple to Android. So why is nonverbal communication so tricky to capture online? Well, as a researcher studying online social interactions, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I had to take a step back and really think about our face-to-face nonverbal communication. And I was really struck by the richness and complexity of face-to-face interactions. When we think about face-to-face nonverbal communication, what usually comes to mind is advice that people will give us when we go to a job interview or give a TED Talk. Project a confident stance, use eye contact, smile. But nonverbal communication is more than that. It's like a partner dance, a tango. What I just described to you are the basic steps of a tango, the slow, slow, quick, quick, fast, okay? But what's critical in nonverbal communication are these dynamic and reciprocal movements between the partners, the nuances of synchronizing with our bodies. So in nonverbal communication, we synchronize our body language and we mirror each other's expression, but this is not only observed in our behavior or in the movement of our 43 facial muscles, but also in the pattern of our brain waves. So in a sense, our capacity to synchronize is critical to understand each other's experience and intention of the other person, what they mean in their message. So in face-to-face interactions, there's actually a social connection between our bodies. But nonverbal communication goes beyond understanding each other. Also affects how we relate to each other. For instance, in a face-to-face interaction, if someone touches you or pats your back, like a server at a restaurant, you're actually going to potentially like them more and might actually tip them more. This is referred to as the Midas touch effect, after King Midas, who turned everything he touched into gold. So just like in a dance, in nonverbal behavior, there's this dynamic exchange of information from different senses. And the best thing is we're not always aware of this. We don't have to think about it. In a sense, we have these shortcuts that automatically fill in the meaning of what we're trying to say. And we actually tune into each other from very early on in our development. And a great example of this is when we watch mothers and babies interact. They're so finely tuned into each other. In one well-known experiment called the still face paradigm, moms and babies are asked to interact naturally. And at one point, the researchers asked the mom to make what's called a still face, to not make any facial expressions, not to interact with the baby. For the babies, this is very confusing, frustrating, and they quickly become distraught, much like what we sometimes feel like in online communication. So in a sense, nonverbal communication can also tell us if our social needs are not being met. Social psychologists suggest that we have a sort of sociometer, which kind of helps us to figure out whether we're being valued, whether we're being included or excluded. And this translates into how we feel about ourselves, our sense of self-esteem, and our sense of social belonging. So can our efforts to capture the complexity of nonverbal communication online truly reproduce face-to-face interactions? Well, we can certainly try to reduce some of the ambiguity of online communication, but this reciprocity, this dance, is very difficult to recreate. The dance becomes interrupted and awkward. We have to think. We can't take advantage of these shortcuts. Have you ever found yourself pausing when you're composing a text message and trying to figure out which of the array of emoticons do I really want to use right now? We don't need to do this in face-to-face. Well, you might say, okay, but text-based interactions are not everything. What about video chat and online three-dimensional environments and avatars? We can certainly capture much more of the nuance of face-to-face interactions in these contexts. Well, things are not necessarily as straightforward as they seem. For instance, in video messaging, simple eye contact can be obstructed due to the design of the hardware. This, in a sense, introduces some missteps into our dance during our interaction. And these missteps can be detected by our sociometer, which leaves us feeling like we're not being socially valued. And when we try to replicate things in virtual environments, things don't always work out the way we expect. In my lab, we try to replicate the Midas touch phenomenon. We ask participants to interact using avatars, and participants that exchange a touch with another avatar actually reported liking the person behind the avatar less, which is the opposite of the Midas touch effect. So these types of results tell us that we still have a lot to learn about how to replicate face-to-face interactions in these virtual contexts. And a final point I want to make today is that technology is also permeating into our face-to-face interactions. We face screens when we talk to each other rather than looking each other in the eye. And this communicates to the other person that they're being ignored, not socially valued. This can really disrupt this reciprocal dance. And screens can become disruptive from early on in development. When researchers at the City University of New York asked moms to interact with babies naturally and then gave them a mobile device to work on, the babies became confused and frustrated and distraught, much like in the still face paradigm. And this is demonstrated here by my daughter, who's staring at the back of a phone as I try to capture that perfect photo. So in addition to challenges with reproducing nonverbal communication online, having screens everywhere also disrupts our face-to-face interactions as well. Okay, so are we doomed to lose our natural dancing skills, our capacity to connect through body language? Well, so the good news is that we're very adaptable, and experience is key. With experience, symbols become more intuitive. So I didn't have to tell you to read the smiley emoticon sideways. But if I turn it around, it's a little bit more awkward because you're used to seeing it the other way. In fact, researchers have shown that our brains perceive these emoticons just like faces, but they have to be in the right orientation. So as we innovate, we have to keep in mind that experience is important, and that hopefully as we get more experience with different types of technologies, we can become better adapted at using these nonverbal cues. But it's still tricky. We still have to figure out how to capture this component of reciprocity and synchrony in these contexts. But as we innovate, what's important to keep in mind at this point is that digital nonverbal expression is no longer a trivial phenomenon relegated to online jokes. It's part of our online language, and it's an important way of helping us to feel understood, valued, like we belong. But let's not forget our dancing skills. Let's look up from our screens and take advantage of the ease of our social connection through our body language. Let's help each other to feel more understood and valued. Thank you.